Good afternoon, and you are all really welcome to the forest. I feel a little bit like a ranger being out here. It's been a cloudy day, really warm to be November, something in the vicinity of 9-10 degrees. And I'd like to talk today about different spaces. And that's a very important thing, and I will try to show you why it's so important. And the subtitle to this would be Are they really that different? Because normally in everyday life, in space level 1, we perceive them to be completely different, these spaces I'm going to mention. And those are direction, representation, reference, association, and causality. So why did I become to the position of questioning whether these spaces were different? Well, the first one was somebody that came quite early to me, and this is one of the creators of what is called cognitive grammar, and his name is Langacker. And in his forms, his symbols, he uses certain type of symbols to signify grammatical could you say grammatical context or grammatical relations? Yeah, grammatical relations. For instance, a proposition, and he used therefore a little dot to be on top of a box to show that proposition can mean on top of, but they could also be on top of in certain verbs that has it inherently this proposition. And I think some of you know that there are languages where all the propositions are, so to speak, in the verbs. That's quite interesting. And I think that came from a practical problem, because if you go from one language to another, you discover this. In one language it's a proposition, and in yet another language is, so to speak, inside the verb. Maybe the fault that Langacker did was he had the idea of separating them. So he always thought the most basic one was, for instance, if you have a verb that meant on top of, and maybe I'm running on top of the ground, something like that, that's just one word in that language. Whereas in Swedish, you have to say I'm running on top of the ground. I do have an example here that is in our own language, Swedish, and in Swedish we have to say things like I'm lying down and sleeping, which is really hard. But this proposition is not a proper proposition in the ordinary sense. You also say in Swedish, I'm sitting down and reading. You would never say that in English. It sounds really weird. I'm standing and talking. Jag står och pratar. It's a completely normal sentence in Swedish. Jag stod och pratade när personen dök upp. I was talking when the person turned up. So what you have here is the gerund form. So stands is what we have in Swedish instead of the grammatical form, gerund. So you see here, when you compare languages, you get the conception there is a significant difference. And of course, this difference is very similar to what we spoke earlier, going from the one word for vision, but it's included, so to speak, included in the verb. I'm looking at a red house or something like that. So everything is baked into the verb. And then we look at it ex posteriori. We start to believing what they really meant was I was looking at the red house. And there we committed the really grave error of mixing ex posteriori and ex anteriori. And if you do that, may God have mercy on your soul, because in that case you can never ever get on the correct path. That's the really worst mistake, and this is a distinction that is so incredibly important, and it's not made in our languages. And I said Langacker committed that error because he seemed to be thinking that there is sort of an original language, and that's what he called the cognitive grammar. So that always includes a preposition, other verbs, other ways of seeing the world, but he starts with a modern Western language, of course. I think that's quite interesting in itself. But even more interesting is because of these problems, that's why this cognitive grammar developed. But also in the early talks together with the person I will mention later here, which is of course Johnson and Lakoff. They were all in the same generation, so to speak. So these things started to happen. The third point I'm going to make here is that you see here, Langacker used symbols. He used space. And one directly wonders, why did he have to do that? Well, I'm getting to that, but there's no way out of this. He needs to use space to show these things. It would be very, very hard to use words. You can try, but it would be complicated. So easier to use space. And whereas Langacker, I think, but it doesn't matter, the example still holds. He's just using this as a tool. And what he thinks is, I'm actually speaking in verbal language, but I'm using this as a tool. And I said, no, that's not true. You need space. And space is the more fundamental. And it's not a helping tool to language. It's more fundamental than language. But later on this, I'm going to come back to this. So, metaphors we live by. I was progressing later to Lakoff and Johnson. And I'd say for me, and I think for most, it's rather a large step between Langacker and Lakoff-Johnson. But that large step also means maybe it will not be taken. You are going to shy back. I did that, and I think there's a lot of people that do that. Especially when the book was fresh in the 80s. I think the risk today is smaller, but it could still happen. What you can see in Lakoff is that time comes from space. We are using spatial thinking to perceive of time. And nota bene here in the second example, a metaphor, the word metaphor is still used, but we're getting closer to space because space is in more combinations, in more use, And it's almost like Lakoff and Johnson are hinting towards that space is being the primordial. Not really so, but almost. It's on that path. Especially, and this is interesting, when you get to the more abstract concepts. The more abstract you get, the more embodied. It's harder not to call them embodied when they are more abstract. And an excellent example is mathematics, where you need spatial thinkers. There wouldn't be any mathematics at all. And they even wrote a special book to show this. But I'm just going to give a brief example here. The idea that you have higher numbers comes from length, and it's a comparison of piles. So that's the original metaphor. And it's actually very similar in a lot of languages. Whereas the transferal of space, the front being future and the back being the past, is not that common. But a pile adding up and you gain length in some way, height usually. And you have that as a metaphor for like a progression in mathematics. It gets more, it's a higher number. High temperature, as we say. This is a very good example, high temperature. There we forgot that we're using numbers. We just say high temperature. But of course we mean that 20 degrees is less than 30 degrees. And then you have a high number. And the correct thing to say would have been, we have a higher number of degrees today. But you just say, we have a higher temperature. And now with this last example, you also got an insight into the reasoning of Lakoff and Johnson. It's quite brilliant. And it's also amazing, nobody thought about this before. And they are aware of this, so they came with an explanation. And it's a little bit, they were all in the same group together with Chomsky. Chomsky being the leader, or well, the philosopher of the study of language. I think that's more correct. And the whole group was led by Chomsky. And Chomsky in the very beginning, he had the tendency to look at space, as I say now, and taking that in consideration. And that affected his followers, his students, his doctors. But he later changed. He wasn't decided yet. It's in this early era when you're still green. And that era can actually be a good era. And that's also where you could go wrong, because you don't know right from wrong. There's no predecessors. There are no predecessors in the area that Chomsky went into. And he decided somewhere in this route, on the route, I'm not going to take that path. But in the beginning he was a bit undecided. And this is so interesting, because he took another path, and that path took him further and further and further away from space. And in the end he got obsessed by eradicating space. So he wanted language to be the explanation for language, to be explained in language, and all the relation being language, and trying his hardest to marginalize away space. And this is a very good example of narrowing. But what happened in this era, Langacker and also the chaps I mentioned in the second thing here, Lakoff and Johnson, they took the other path, and they decided we're going to stick to this one, we see if it works. And then also is another tendency, you do this in contrast too. So contradiction is not always a bad thing. Well, it's very useful actually. but they did it in contradistinction to Chomsky. There's no doubt about that. And that meant they more took this route, and this route proved to be very fruitful for their own thinking, and they got so convinced, so they published. It took some time, it took a decade before it had its breakthrough. And that's how things usually go. And I think that's very important as well to understand that it's not that easy. If you're looking at retrospect, you're going to think, oh, more obvious they're going to find out Lakoff and Johnson, depending how the things was turning out. But it's not necessarily so. Not at all. Not in the real world. The real world is not the world of ex posteriori. It doesn't have reality to it. It has other nice things. It has explanation. It has communicative function, force, but it's not reality, not at all. But they took it further, and after they published this book, Metaphors We Live By, they published a couple of others, and then came one, Philosophy in the Flesh, and that's even more brilliant. You don't, if you read the first book, you won't be disappointed with the second book, not at all. It's even more interesting. They managed to heighten the interest. And they look at philosophical concepts, and this is also a concept that covers most for science, cognition science, thinking when we really want to think about the world, we ordinary people. And they show that spatiality is even more important, and spatiality, it's what makes polarity. Polarity is not outside this world. So they are the first one to say that, and they also say that sameness could come from space and not from some other weird place, like Chomsky would have argued, or have to argue, not even voluntarily anymore. And I'd say here you also get the first hint that direction could actually be something inside space, not outside of it. Like in Newton, because Newton has space, yeah, he has empty space, but his trajectories are outside space. Where they're coming from, he never explains. Well, nobody really asked the question until quantum physics. Where does a trajectory come from? It needs to come from spaces as well. But they are hinting to the idea that direction could be a trait of space as well. In the bottom of most of the metaphors, you find space. Sometimes you find it by using time, but time takes its start from space, and that means that indirectly or directly sometimes space is always included in the game. And you feel really when you read Lakoff and Johnson that relations and repetitions, things that are obviously things that are parallel, are actually traits of space, internal to space, properties of space, or what space can do. Maybe it's better to express it. What can space do? That should be the question. Now let me just fill up the coffee, and I have to check it's still visible. But these ideas were taken much further by the third example, and that's Barbara Tversky. And she showed that a thing like decontextualization, that is isolation from a spatial context was already done by the Neolithic man. And they did this by carving into the walls of caves and also into rocks. And what they did, they first carved something or painted something on the wall. There was a context, a happening of some sort. For instance, the hunting of buffaloes. And then a bit underneath you can see how they take something out of that picture. They take the buffalo or the hunting man and they sort of decontextualize the hunting man. And what you could do next is recontextualize. So you can bring hunting mans that no longer part of this hunting scene. They are being decontextualized, and that means they can move them around both on the wall and in the head. And here you realize this is something spatial, even if you're doing it in your head. You start with the wall, but you then can do it in your head. And you can make loads of new arrangements, and Neolithic man does that. They arrange them in different order, and you can put the hunting tools. You can decontextualize the hunter once more and take the hunting tools apart from him. So you have two separate things, so to speak, a bit more abstract things, pieces of space if you want. And then you can make a collection of hunting tools to show that you have a lot of hunting tools, or you have a storage for them, or you have wealth or something else. But you could also do, and this is interesting, you can take the same hunting scene and instead you can decontextualize the time. So you can put it in maybe 3 parts. You have some sort of preparation in, maybe I want to say on the left hand side of the hunting image I mentioned earlier, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We actually have a better guess, and that would be it's coming from the right. Most writing systems starts from the right, so that's probably a much better guess. And once you have that established, the order, you can take them apart, and you can have the preparation for the hunt, you can have the actual hunt, and you can have the retrieving of the flesh afterwards. And you can later, so to speak, decontextualize this, and you can have an abstract concept of beginning, and you can also compare maybe different preparations. But and the end, the storage of flesh could be turned into sort of verb or something like that. So you see here, you can also decontextualize time, but you're still using space. You're doing it on the wall, and you need space to take the time areas apart from each other, and then you can have, just like in the case of a hunter who's isolated, it's decontextualized, maybe the first seed of generalizations or universalization, or the monetary unit, maybe the first seed of that. But the brilliant thing, you can take them apart and you can arrange them in a new order, which doesn't have to be locked in the same way. One could say you're opening space up in a bit, you're making it a bit freer. The whole process is all a relocalization of space. This was taken even further by Rosen. I think it's Stephen or Steve Rosen. And he was the first person, for me at least, to mention the Klein bottle. He showed that reference and representation actually could have its origin in space. This was for me a most interesting development, because still in Barbara Tversky, representation still is something external to space. But in her space, it still has this Newtonian trait of being only a canvas for manipulation, made by the caveman on a stone wall. But Rosen, with Klein bottle, makes it clear that space actually can penetrate itself. And being its own subject, it can represent. So I think Barbara from the beginning, or still, or halfway, because she's very, very close of saying that thinking is space. She's very close. Because once you decontextualize something, you can move it around, you can do it on the wall, but you can also do it in your head. You can add up, for instance, the spears. You can add up the hunted buffaloes, and you can begin to number them, or at least make a pile in your head of them. But Rosen makes this incredibly much clearer, and as I said before, you really need Barbara Tversky before, otherwise you're just going to shy away when you read Rosen. Even if the Klein bottle is part of reality, even if it's very compelling, it's simply not enough for, you can't stomach it, it's too much. You need the previous established conclusions. You need to have trodden the path. It needs to be taken. You can't really digest this. And of course there's a lot of people that say, I take Stephen Rosen, but maybe they take it from point of authority. I accept him as authority. I accept it because it's a part of reality. Now, all good reasons, but they're not the best reason. The best reason is you accept it because you understand it. And that's no longer an acceptance. It's just, you just understand it. So this is what we need to bring to the project also. Well, we're aiming to bring this to the project, and that's understanding. That's been our aim the whole time. But I also show here you cannot jump any step in the understanding process, because it's a process. And to read Stephen Rosen directly and understand directly just won't work. And if you say it works, that's even worse. Some things have to be established. And why is that? Well, another good reason is that the subject is included, and therefore what's inside the subject, how it's organized, how the knowledge is organized. And to enforce Stephen Rosen on the knowledge that's not mature enough, that doesn't have that structure, that's just wrong, shouldn't be done, cannot be done. That's the correct phrase. But you can still say I understand it or something like that, but you don't. I don't think we really know what understanding is anymore. I think that is a bigger problem than we don't understand so much. It's not only the lack of knowledge. We don't know when we don't know things. We think we know a lot more than we actually know. Well, and then I'm talking about explicit knowledge. Implicit, we know a lot more than we think. But a lot of those explicit knowledge, we don't know. It's not explicit knowledge to us because we don't have the implicit knowledge. This is actually a new theory. I forgot the name of it, but maybe it's not that important, but it's quite funny. It was a couple of decades ago. It was a man who understood that if you write with lemon juice, you will get a writing on the paper that you can see first, but after a while something happens and the writing you did disappears. It becomes invisible. What you need to do is heat up the paper a little bit, maybe using a candle, not too close, and voila, all of a sudden the writing will appear again. And what you just heard now, that's explicit knowledge. That's explicit knowledge. You can listen to this, you can try this yourself, and you can actually do the experiment without having enough implicit knowledge not to do as a bank robber did many years ago. Well, this is the example a couple of decades ago. He understood this with the ink disappearing or becoming invisible. So he took a gun and he bought a couple of lemons, he juiced them, and he bathed his whole face in this lemon juice, and then he robbed a bank. Well, at least that was what he was thinking he was doing. For some mad reason, well, he got the money, but he didn't get far because he wasn't invisible. He was caught by the cameras, and he was really quickly apprehended and sentenced to jail. But this goes to show explicit knowledge does not equal implicit knowledge. So you can gather a lot of information bits here and there, explicit. You can actually use them, but you still will not have the implicit knowledge. So whereas we don't have to be so humble when it comes to the implicit knowledge, we need to trust that more. We also need to be much more, and this is, we need to be more humble when it comes to the explicit knowledge. And especially because it's so easy to think you understand something fully. So that's the opposite holds in a bit. We don't know how much implicit we have, and we also do not have the implicit knowledge to a lot of things we think we understand. And especially when it comes to complicated relations. I had this experience on a lecture a couple of years ago, and people start discussing Thomas Kuhn and falsification principle from Popper, and well, these people didn't really understand what falsification was. They were using it grammatically correct, but they didn't know the content of it. They were teachers, and you need to have that knowledge embodied somehow, because falsification does not equal truth. It's a process, and that process can only be understood. You need to have done something similar to understand it. It cannot easily be described. And I think in this special case you could describe it, but it would be very lengthy, and it would mean that you have at least some intuition, but these one didn't have anyone, and they know so little, so they could be, then you can be even more certain. You can be too confident, and they thought you made science somehow. Well, you hear in the end you hear them saying things that are completely nonsense. I say we use the falsification principle to develop science, and it's not true. Popper never meant it that way. It's a way of describing what science does. It's not a method to be used. It's what it already does, already do. It's a big difference, but you cannot know that if you only read it. And to get the implicit knowledge, it takes a lot more. Well, maybe 100 books and loads of discussion can make the explicit so the network of explicit so big that you will get to the implicit. I think that could happen. That's quite interesting in itself. Well, speaking on knowledge, I think it could be good in this instance before it gets too dark here. I don't know how much dark it's going to get. Well, I just want to mention something that's called technological knowledge. And this is very similar to these examples. There were two teachers actually who thought that Popper's falsification principle was a method and not a description. Knowledge technology, and I'm now reading from Love of Knowledge from Tartan Talku. Knowledge technology presents a tremendous potential for the extension of human intelligence, perhaps as significant in its impact as the earliest technology of hand axes and cutting stones. Such technology has a remarkable capacity to feed back on itself, so that great changes is possible in short time. The field of artificial intelligence, though still in its infancy, this was some years ago, but you could say still in its infancy, often offers a striking example. Eventually, computers programmed to emulate the mind may be able to open unexpected avenues for the human capacity to know. Sorry. And what this means is that we developed a certain way at looking at knowledge, and that in itself is a tool. So that is a tool. Whereas in the example of falsification, well, it's sort of a tool. Yeah, actually, it's sort of a tool, but it's just a description, well, a distant description of the tool. But truth, it could be a tool. Truth in science, which is a different truth from the ones we used before Newtonian science. We did not earlier meant by truth an objective, independent, repeatable observation. Sorry for the pause. I just saw an animal. I don't know what animal it was. It was a little bit too big to be a fox, so I wonder what it was. Very interesting. Well, we say it was a fox. Truth as being an independent, objective observance where you don't include the observer, that is a knowledge concept. That's a tool. It's called truth. Then there's a new meaning to truth, and on a daily basis we use this. This is part of common language, and this is what Tartan Tulku points to when he speaks about knowledge technology. sort of a technology, a tool in language, a tool in thinking. And this tool is very similar to what Barbara Tversky showed, but not exactly the noun part she showed, but the verb part, the action of decontextualizing. And there's no need to point out that specifically in Barbara Tversky's book, because she's speaking about what's happening on the wall and how we're using space, but not the action, the idea that could have been in the caveman's head before he did it. But that's something that happens in Newtonian science. And we establish a tool for knowing truth. And it becomes this new truth since 1689, without a doubt. And this is well established today. We say this is true. But we need to know what Newton did, and the truth within Newton unrelated objective observance is not, for the first, what we say in quantum physics. We do not say unrelated objective observer. Instead, the subjective observer is there, and it's part of the process, not to be taken out, and is not even considered a good thing to do that. So one could say it's a broader method. Of course, all the old examples would still be taken in considerations, but that would be seen in some cases to be not adequate, and even, and you need to understand that this is important, according to quantum physics, an independent, unrelated object, subject, subject not participant, subject independent observation and a truth coming from that, that could actually, according to quantum physics, be wrong. So we have a different tool today. We have a broader tool, but it's also sharper, but it's definitely different. And this is what Tartan Tolko in his book Love of Knowledge is hinting to. And he slowly, in the beginning of the book, established this neologism, and it's very interesting. It's not really, you noticed after a while, not really of our tradition. It's not only new, but it doesn't really fit our tradition. But it's still very interesting. I understand it, as I understand it, it could be quite useful in the future to use that one. It's a very good way from, well, actually the perspective of the layman, the daily user. Yeah, that's the perspective it takes, which is a very good perspective of the layman, because it becomes established as true for everyone, even if they're not doing Newtonian science, even if they're not mechanical engineers, even if they're not building a bridge or checking out the acidity of the drinking water in different ponds all over the world. And that's a big problem. That's a narrowing of everything, and it will not give you the expected result. But we sort of acknowledge the truth concept in Newtonian physics. We integrated it in our own language because it was incredibly successful, as Tartan Tolko is mentioning, but it might not be the best thing. We could find better things, more encompassing, better suited to our lives, because that life is actually in a world that is ruled by quantum physics. Well, I think I'm going to round up here because we now hit the dusk, but I say thank you very much, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon. Yes, it is afternoon, although it's dark. November in Sweden. Okay, thank you.